I really do believe that many of the people in leadership, meaning elected officials who claim that 2020 was a stolen election, that we need to recount the ballots or whatever, other than through the normal judicial process, I think they do better. And I have expressed that numerous times. That's not a surprise. Look, democracy requires belief and credibility in elections, and so people who are casting aspersions on our election process are threatening one of the bases of our very foundation.
And we'll say the rest of it for him, are therefore undemocratic. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. From the man who 9 years ago was the Republican Party's standard bearer. He is who Republican primary voters picked to represent them as their nominee. He didn't prevail, but that's who they picked. Out with that very urgent warning yesterday that American elections cannot function unless people in his own party put an end to the lies and the fraud conspiracies, that a democracy needs people to believe in it to survive. Senator Mitt Romney's message mirrors the premise of a brand new report written by 24 experts on law, elections, and information security. They describe this, a, quote, United States electoral process under great stress, and they write this, quote, over the last 2 decades, hyper-polarized politics and very close elections have led to fights over election rules and controversy over the administration of U.S. elections. No longer can we take for granted that people will accept election results as legitimate. The United States faces continued threats to peaceful transitions of power after election authorities or courts have declared a presidential election winner. To avoid future conflicts, they make 24 recommendations. Among them, quote, states should adopt permanent general election emergency statutes to protect the right to vote. Social media and website platforms should preserve their capacity to address false information about when, where, and how people vote and other threats to free and fair elections. And this, quote, states should strengthen laws to protect election officials from violence, from threats of violence and intimidation, and alleviate unnecessary burdens on such officials. Underscoring the importance of our elections has been a mission of President Joe Biden's throughout his campaign and his presidency. Biden has stressed that everyone's voice needs to be heard, and he has talked about how we must restore a common set of values, a soul, if you will, as he says, to our nation. Today, we learned that the president will make a major address to the nation on the ongoing threats to democracy the day after the next GOP presidential primary debate later this month. On that, the Times reports this, quote, one location for the speech that has been under discussion is the McCain Institute. That's according to a person familiar with the planning. The institute, which is devoted to fighting for democracy, is named for Senator John McCain, a Republican who served for more than 20 years in the Senate with Mr. Biden, who sparred repeatedly with former President Donald Trump, the Republican Party's frontrunner in 2024. That is where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Rick Hasen is here, election law expert and law and political science professor at UCLA Law School. Joining me at the table for the hour, New York Times editorial board member Mara Gay, and our friend, the executive producer of Showtime's The Circus and the host of the Hell and High Water podcast from The Recount, John Helm, is here. Rick, I want to give you some time to go through the report, but I just want to frame it in the conversation I just had in the last hour. Protecting election officials requires the work of the FBI, whose agents are under so much threat of political violence that they've set up a unit to protect the FBI. At some point, we're going to need a unit to protect the unit that's protecting the FBI, who's going to be tasked with protecting the election officials. How do we break the cycle?
Well, I think you have to recognize that there is a center of this country that doesn't believe the last election was stolen, that wants fair, common sense approaches to fixing our election problems. It starts with recognizing that we have problems, recognizing that it's not just about elections being run in a fair way, but also people having confidence that they're run in a fair way. So that requires things like transparency. It requires lots of different steps, which we outline in the report. But of course, it requires protecting those who run our elections and count the votes. And I hope that those are people who are our neighbors. They are people that are in our communities. I hope that we will find the resources to make sure that around the country, the people who are running our elections, from the poll workers to our secretaries of state, are protected so they can run a free and fair electoral process.
The report comes at a time when the crisis is acute. Let me show you some of the testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee from the Secretary of State of Michigan, Jocelyn Benson.
One night in December 2020, I was about to put my son to bed when dozens of individuals descended upon our home. Growing in numbers over the course of an hour, they stood outside my front door, waking my neighbors, shouting obscenities and graphic threats into bullhorns. To this day, these images and this memory of that evening still haunts me. This was not the first, nor was it the last time some time or a group of people showed up at my home or threatened me, my staff, or many of the hundreds of local election officials in our state. As a result, there is an omnipresent feeling of anxiety and dread that permeates our daily lives and those of our families.
Rick, as a group, if you study our state of politics for election officials from the state level to the local level, people like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, jurors from the state level to the federal level, if you look at Trump's prosecutions in Georgia, D.C., and Florida, media, if they've all been maligned and delegitimized among, say, 30% of a country's population, what happens next?
Well, so, part of what we're trying to do are figure out ways that we can rapidly respond to conspiracy theories and take the oxygen out of claims. One of the things that was so effective in 2020 was when a claim was made that there were, say, ballots in a ditch there, the media was there, election officials were there to counter it. You're not going to convince everyone in this hyper-polarized world of negative partisanship. But if the goal is to convince everyone, it's going to fail. But you have to convince enough people who might have serious questions. Is the election fairly conducted? How will I know that my vote's going to count, that their votes are going to count, and that the election is fair? And that's really what we're aimed at. We're not going to solve the problem of polarization in our elections and the kind of the ramifications of the earlier lies about the 2020 election before 2024. But there are lots of tangible steps in law, media, politics, and tech that we can take for the people in the middle so that they can be convinced, whether Trump wins or Trump loses, Biden wins, Biden loses, that I may not be happy with the result, but I agree that the election was conducted in a way that was fair, and I can, just reorganize and fight again next time for my candidate.
One of the things, the report is so timely, and one of the things that we saw that happened today, a headline that crossed the wire in the 2 o'clock hour, is that state Senate Republicans in Wisconsin voted to remove the Wisconsin Elections Commission administrator. Her name's Megan Wolf. She's a nonpartisan elections official. Following 2020, Republicans turned on her, calling for her resignation. I wonder if it's like you plug one leak and then we're going to have to go and plug another leak, or are you optimistic that if we take these steps and if a majority of Americans are behind them, we can get to a better place?
Well, this is not the first election administrator who's been essentially fired or attempted to be fired by the Wisconsin state legislature. Wisconsin's kind of ground zero. They're fighting in their state Supreme Court over who controls that court after there was an election that shifted the balance of power. It's a very dire situation in a place like Wisconsin, but I know that there are people who are fighting for democracy there. There was controversy, you may remember, about the use of drop boxes. Trump claimed that the election was stolen in Wisconsin. There was no evidence the election was stolen in Wisconsin. In a lot of ways, this battle has to be fought state by state among the local people who understand what's going on, who can provide the facts. And I think that, if an election administrator is going to be fired by legislators, they may end up paying a price for that, because voters don't want to see that. And they recognize that when this stuff is happening, it's not about lack of sound election practice. It's about trying to either please the base of the Republican Party or trying to you just muddy the waters so that if there is an attempt in the future at election subversion, there could be some claim that there was something wrong with how the election was conducted.